why do you think that Lynch was so compelled to, and he's been asked this question a million times and he has his own answers, but I'm talking about through your perspectives, knowing who he is, the kind of art that he made, the impact that it had on the culture. What compels David Lynch to employ such grotesquerie and off-puttedness into this work? And what was the function of it?
Yeah. So like I think Adam and I both said before, Lynch is a man who saw great beauty in people and places and the world. But I think Lynch, as I mentioned before, Lynch is also, you can tell he's pragmatic. And you can tell from one statement alone that he said, where he's talking about why he did commercials. He's famously done a commercial for Gucci. He's famously done a commercial for PlayStation. He's an artist. And granted, PlayStation was grading on a curve because the PlayStation commercials he did are bizarre.
Yes.
They paid David Lynch to do exactly what David Lynch was expected to deliver. So maybe that's grading on a curve, but nonetheless, many people would look at that as selling out. Are you doing it for Sony, a corporation? And it's like, yeah, because they pay me. Like he, probably made a quarter or $500,000 doing that PlayStation commercial.
Sure.
But knowing that alone, I think it also explains why there's so much darkness in his films as well. And it's because he's pragmatic. This is a man who understands the world. There is great beauty in the world. There are many people that are beautiful in this world and good and well-natured. But for every Gandhi, you get a Hitler.
Yeah.
The world is a beautiful place. The world is also, at times, a fucked up place.
Yeah.
And I see this as a man who knew that and knew that it would resonate with people. Like I said, I think that this is very mask off. He makes no concessions on the beauty that he sees in the world and the beauty that he sees in people, but he also makes no concessions about showing the utter darkness that's there. And also from a pragmatic stance myself, when you go that way, it's better writing. When you give your character something like a Frank Booth, it does push you further. But I think what's different is that, you could show somebody Blue Velvet and they might say, I don't think we're going to be friends anymore. But if you show somebody Irreversible, they're definitely not going to be friends with you anymore. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
Because from everything I've heard about Irreversible, or if the German version of Funny Games is the same as the American version, there is a sense of cruelty there in films like those as examples. And I'm not using that to attack Haneke or Gaspar Noé, but there is a brutality in certain films and a bleakness in certain films that make you say, aye, all right. But you don't get that in a film like Blue Velvet. You see a young man who wants to do the right thing. You see a woman who will do whatever it takes to get her child back. Yeah. And you see at the very end of the film that she genuinely loves her child. And there is a balance there. And I think a film like Mulholland Drive is a little more complicated because that's definitely a bleaker film. But I could see how a film like that is him expressing his own frustrations on the film industry at that time. But he still, in that first half, shows what could have been.
Sure.
And there are people who do live that. And it's it's not to say, oh, this was what Naomi Watts' character envisioned, and that's not attainable. It's no, there are people who live that experience in the industry.
Yeah.
And the bitterness comes from the jealousy that comes through because somebody does get to have that, and that character didn't. Yeah, he chooses to show the bleakness of the world because the world can be bleak.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the world can be beautiful too. You can't get one without the other.
Yeah, that's sort of a message that is well delineated in Blue Velvet,
Yeah.
and many of the others, of course. But he's very forward with that about Blue Velvet. Is there anything else that you want to add to that, Adam?
That was very well put. So I'll say this though to kind of add a little bit onto it. David Lynch also has a very kind of childlike understanding of good and evil. Like it's not for while the films themselves are kind of nuanced, the characters kind of aren't.
Childlike in a good way or a bad way?
In a good way. Again, you look at a character like Frank Booth. There is nothing redeemable about Frank. Not a single thing is redeemable about him. And yet, you look at a character like Sandy, she's just pure innocence in a lot of respects. I mean, Jeffrey is a little bit shades of gray, and I'm sure you can go down the line of his films and find characters that are a little bit shades of gray. But how the world in which Lynch builds and how it functions, there's good people and there's bad people, and sometimes really bad people on top of that.
Mm.
And I think the reason why he does choose to do the grotesqueness is to just elevate how terrible those bad people can be, to John's point. Showing that, yeah, there is great evil in the world. As kind of Jeffrey says when he's breaking down after he sees Frank brutalize Dorothy for the first time in Blue Velvet, and he's trying to rationalize it. And it's before Sandy gives her Robin speech. So I think that that's kind of why he chooses to do those grotesque things, is to show, to John's point, yeah, that the world can be kind of dark and cruel, but then he can also show the beauty of it literally the next scene.
Right.
As it were. He kind of does that vacillating back and forth. And again, and that's something, because directing is all about tone management. And if you sometimes do those scenes back to back, it feels like it should be such a whiplash on paper. It's like, wait, you're telling me you're showing the worst thing you've ever seen, then the next scene is the best thing you've ever seen? That should not work. Mm-hmm. But yet, again, Lynch's confidence brings that into a landing so smoothly that, again, no other director could do that. The closest one is, because I was thinking about other like surrealists that were contemporaries of Lynch. The only one I can think of is Ken Russell. Is the only one I think comes close. And a very different filmmaker, though.
Yes, still very different. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Very British.
Very British. The other surrealists I thought of were British. One's technically American, that's Gilliam, but he's an expat and considers himself British.
Right. Sorry, what were you saying, John?
The only filmmaker I could think of that could be, and I haven't seen any of his other films yet, even though I think Criterion just put some of them on, so I'm going to try and give some of them a watch. I think Arrow has a few as well. This is a sponsored ad for Arrow and Criterion, by the way. That's a lie. They're not paying me, but I wish they'd pay me. But I love the service. I'm going to continue using it anyway. I'd be curious to see what the Japanese filmmaker Nobuhiko Obayashi does, because this is the director of House. Because House is the only other like surrealist film I can think of that has, like a cult to semi-mainstream appeal as more and more people get introduced to the film. That film, as we all know, and anybody who's listening, is that film is totally bonkers. But he was a very mainstream filmmaker in Japan. He was very famous. And he had a career in the commercial world before he did House. So I would be curious to see what his balance would be like, and if his films were more normal.
Mhm.
or like they had a surrealist element, but they were doing more straightforward films. Because Houses
Yeah.
is like kind of unique gem where it does follow a plot, as most horror movies do,
Right.
but it's a very surreal film
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's still interesting to compare this guy to other people because there is something so distinctive, even among the most distinctive. It's wild. And one other surrealist, because we're talking about those that I would mention in this conversation, is Jan Schwankmeyer, who was the great Czech surrealist who made a lot of claymation and stop motion animation. I think I showed one of his movies at one of my movie parties once, which was probably a little otique. He also did an amazing adaptation of Alice in Wonderland and so many short films that are absolutely incredible. And he was able to weave idea webs in very interesting ways. But again, mostly using animation.
Yeah.
Lynch was not an animator at the end of the day. He started out wanting to really animate, which is very interesting. It's almost like he was an animator trapped in a filmmaker's body, because he started out with paintings and he said, wouldn't it be great if these paintings could move? And then he made these short films. The very first ones, like the alphabet and so on, were actual animations. But then he kind of grew out of that and said, no, wait, I want these things to be real. I want them to feel like they're real people. So he kind of combined the animation vibe and atmosphere with the actual live action medium, which is just so fascinating in and of itself when we're just talking about the medium with which he worked. So he's a combination of a lot of things and yet nothing.